All right, so this is week 4 of the Christian Business Project Bible Study, and today we're going to be talking about employment. If you want more information or have missed any of the previous episodes, at the bottom of the screen during the recording, if you're watching this after the day we do it, you'll see the christianbusinessproject.com/Bible study, and you can go back and catch up. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel, receive them there. Make sure you let folks know that they can subscribe via the email list, and they can get this stuff in their inbox the day after we record it. Some people are on here live, but most of us watch it after the fact, and that's just fine. So today we're talking about employment. Again, just to remind people, if you need a copy of this book, Business for the Glory of God, we're using that as the outline for this 12-week series, and we have additional copies available to folks that want it. I know I've mailed out one out of state, and I know we've given a couple away locally, so if you want one, we still have a few, and we're happy to give them away. Today, kind of the overlying theme is hiring people to do work is fundamentally good and provides many opportunities for glorifying God, but also many temptations to sin. And that's obviously thematic every single week. We discuss this stuff. We do talk about our ultimate purpose, which is glorifying God, but also recognizing and maybe being more aware of the temptations to sin in these opportunities. This week, we're going to be talking about employment, both from the employer's perspective primarily, but also from the employee's perspective, which is helpful. And I wanted to read something that's actually not in the book that we'll come back to. And in fact, I'll save the quote till later, but I want to start with this question. Are we admirers of Jesus or are we followers? And I want you to think about that as we go forward. If you are just an admirer or a follower, and it is an either or type thing, and we'll discuss that as we go forward. I did want to start. We've got a handful of scriptures. If you do go to the christianbusinessproject.com/Bible study, each week is laid out, both the video and the scriptures for that week. And we do have challenges each week that we hope that you'll take on each day. It's a series of 3 to 4 questions, kind of evaluating our own beliefs and positions on the subjects that we've been discussing, but also opportunities to surround yourself with a community of people who will speak truth into your life on those things, and you do the same for them. I'm going to jump right into the book here. We're talking about employment once again. One of the first places that we see God addressing employment is both in Leviticus chapter 19 and Deuteronomy chapter 24, and it's about paying timely your wages to the folks who have worked for you. But I want to start in Luke chapter 10, and this is Jesus talking here, and I'm going to get to the key verse, which is verse 7, but this is Luke chapter 10. Jesus sends out the 72. After this, starting in verse 1, the Lord appointed 72 others and sent them on ahead of him, 2 by 2, into every town and place where he himself was about to go. And he said to them, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Go your way. Behold, I am sending you out as lambs in the midst of wolves. Carry no money bag, no knapsack, no sandals, and greet no one on the road. Whatever house you enter, first say, peace be to this house. And if a son of peace is there, your peace will rest upon him. But if not, it will not return to you. And here's verse 7, the key verse. And remain in the same house, eating and drinking what they provide. For the laborer deserves his wages. Do not go from house to house whenever you enter a town and they receive you, eat what is set before you. So getting back to the key part of that, Jesus has appointed the 72 after the 12 disciples, and these folks are going out in the midst of wolves, as Jesus says, to share the gospel of Jesus Christ, as it was given to us and also given to the disciples. And as he is employing them, he goes through a lot of things, preparing them both for the danger that's coming, but then kind of casually mentions in there that pay people what they are owed. That the people who work are owed what they are owed because of the work they've done. And that goes back to a few things we discussed in the intro about commitment and the things that that glorify God or imitating God in all that he does. 1, he keeps his word. 2, he has perfect justice, which by definition means he not only takes care of things that are unjust, but he rewards those who are doing things that he is in favor of, but has certainly commanded us to do. So that's Luke chapter 10. And I wanted to read one more to you from the book of Luke, and it's in chapter 3, and this is John speaking here, and the key verse here is verse 14. But the question is raised in verse 10, and the crowds asked him, what then shall we do? And he answered them, whoever has 2 tunics is to share with him who has none, and whoever has food is to do likewise. Tax collectors also came to be baptized and said to him, "Teacher, what shall we do?" And he said to them, "Collect no more than you are authorized to do." Soldiers also asked him. Remember, soldier is the primary occupation of people in this area where John is preaching. And they said, "And we, what shall we do?" And he said to them, "Do not extort money from anyone by threats or by false accusation, and be content with your wages." So we've got two commands there in the book of Luke. The first in chapter 10, I read, obviously it comes later, but Jesus saying, make sure that people are paid what they owed. And this is John talking about being content with that. So there's a couple of really good lessons in there as well. I want to dive back into the book here, Business for the Glory of God by Wayne Grudem, and read a couple of things to you. Keeping in mind, the theme we're going to talk about today, are we admirers of Jesus or are we followers? We're going to come back to that and how that's defined. Hiring of one person by another is necessary for a greater production of goods, but working in groups requires the oversight of a manager, or if you're a business owner, a leader, and this is most often an owner who pays the others for their work. This is a wonderful ability that God has given us. Paying another person for his or her labor is an activity that is uniquely human. Think about that. It is shared by no other creature. No other creature pays another person for his or her labor in an activity that is specific with tasks laid out before them and accomplished in a way that is defined. The ability to work for other people for pay or to pay other people for their work is another way that God has created us so that we would be able to glorify him more fully in such relationships. And of course, the relationships that come about that also glorify God. From the owner's perspective, if you're an owner or a manager or a leader or supervisor, he takes pleasure in us when he sees us showing honesty, fairness, trustworthiness, kindness, wisdom, and skill, and keeping our word regarding how much we promise to pay or what work, if you're the employee, we agreed to do. That relationship is also an opportunity to demonstrate proper exercise of authority and proper responses of authority in imitation of the authority that has eternally existed between the Father and Son in the Trinity. Keeping in mind, we're going to keep asking this question, are we admirers of Jesus or are we followers? Now, I hope you're formulating in your mind an answer to that question. And I suspect, based on the way I asked it, you're probably positioning yourself to be a follower, but I'm going to go ahead and describe that later as we get into it. So one of the overarching themes of this, obviously, is when an employer-employee relationship or arrangement is working properly, both parties benefit. Again, if we're imitating God and what he has commanded us to do, we are obviously being productive with our time. Last week, if you were able to participate or watch, hold on, I got to admit somebody. We talked about the blessing and benefit, but also the responsibility of productivity and production. Sorry, somebody's trying to join and I hadn't let them in yet. But the responsibility and the privilege of production and productivity, but also the temptations that can arise, much like we talked about prior with ownership, accumulating things for the benefit of being seen by others other than God is a real temptation that all of us are vulnerable and susceptible to. The same thing is true in the idea of employment. If you're the employer, and I have been, for 20 plus years of my life, there is a temptation to take advantage of that relationship, maybe to benefit you more than is warranted by the agreement to the work to do. But also as an employee, which I have also been for a number of years in my life, to try and get done just as little as can be done to get by. Share a quick story. My brother Sean and I, and also my twin Calvin and I have had this conversation when I was in high school and prior, but also after. I really was convinced that I was giving my best effort in playing basketball, but also school, but I'll use basketball as the illustration here. I was tall and I'm sort of skilled, but I also, as I've shared with you before, had some medical issues. And those medical issues became a crutch for me, not because they weren't real, they were, but I used them as an excuse for not working harder than I was working. So in my mind at that time, I was convinced that I was working as hard as anybody else and probably harder because I knew I had some deficiencies and there was some fruit being borne. But looking back on that time in my life with an honest evaluation, and if I had the capacity to do that at that time, I would have had this same conversation. I was really doing as much or as little as I needed to get by. I was blessed, but maybe cursed with the ability to be clever Not clever, haha, but clever enough to look good when I needed to look good in front of the people I wanted to look good in front of. And so I had a false sense of commitment, a false sense of success, and also a false sense of hard work. Fast forward a bit, and I'd had some jobs in high school, starting at age 14, like many of you. Going from about age 14 to probably, if I'm being honest, about age 24, that same thing was manifesting itself in me. And unfortunately, by the time I was 21, I also had responsibility for other people in employment. So both as an employer, as an employee, I did my best to look good when I needed to look good. But if I'm being honest in my effort, I was not working as hard as I could. To quote Colossians 3:23, I was not working as if working for the Lord. I was working for the benefit of being seen when I wanted to be seen, and probably doing the bare minimum to get by, and maybe even less than was expected of me. And I was taking advantage of that relationship. And it also manifested itself in my leadership at that time in my life. And I was young and immature, but I make no excuses. I also allowed other people to do the same. If I thought they were doing a good job, instead of being intentional on follow-up or being thorough with my commitment to them and to the persons who owned the business, I was allowing them to do the same, do the bare minimum to get by, so that all of us could do the bare minimum to get by. And you can see the falsehood, not only from a worldly perspective. You're not going to get great effort or great production from that, but also from God's perspective, it is not imitating God in any way, shape, or form, or glorifying Him to just get by. And so I wanted to dive a little bit more into the relationship part, and I'm going to go back into the book here, and then we're going to get into some of the temptations of that. When the employer-employee relationship is working properly, both parties benefit. We said that. This allows love for the other person to manifest itself. For example, let's say I have a job sewing shirts in someone else's shop. I can honestly seek the good of my employer and seek to sew as many shirts as possible for him, along with the attention to quality. And I'd like to read 1 Timothy chapter 6, specifically verse 2. As Paul is addressing Timothy here, and I'm going to start in verse 1. Let all who are under a yoke as bondservants regard their own masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and the teaching may not be reviled. Those who have believing masters must not be disrespectful on the ground that they are brothers. Rather, they must serve all the better, since those who benefit by their good service are believers and beloved. It's really interesting here that Paul describes in verse 2 the relationship between believers and perhaps their masters who are believers. They're to be considered brothers. But I don't think God is separating how you respond to a person who is your employer or your master. If you read verse 1 again, let all who are under a yoke as bondservants regard their own masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and the teaching may not be reviled. In other words, he doesn't have a separate set of rules specifically for how hard you work or the honor that is due your employer, or in this instance, your master. He's saying that all are worthy of that. So that's the thing that we have control over as employees. But if we flip that narrative, we also have that opportunity and that responsibility as employers. There is a great illustration there of, everybody's due this respect and this effort, but specifically in verse 2, he gets to if they're brothers or believers to be treated as brothers. Wayne Grudem goes on to say, if you hire me to work in your business, you are doing good for me, and you're providing both of us with many opportunities to glorify God. It is the same way with hiring people to produce services, whether hiring teachers to teach in a school, doctors to care for in a clinic, mechanics to fix cars, or painters to paint houses. The employer-employee relationship enables people to create services for others that were not there before. But, as we do every time, there are temptations to that. An employer can exercise his authority with harshness and oppression and unfairness. All of us that have been in the workforce a long time have probably experienced some employer or boss or supervisor who's been unreasonably harsh or oppressive or unfair. And if you've had pay withheld arbitrarily and unreasonably, Leviticus 19:13 speaks to that, or he might underpay his workers, keeping wages so low that workers have no opportunity to improve their standard of living. And again, that is contrary to what God shared through Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 14. He might also become puffed up with pride, which is my greatest temptation. James writes about sins of oppressive employees in verse 4 of chapter 5, and he says this, "Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts." In fact, if you read the first few verses of James chapter 5, it is a rebuke to the wealthy of the day who were withholding things from their employees, which is a common practice in those days. But I would challenge us that are doing this together. I think it's still a challenge today. For example, you may not be an employer who pays an unreasonably low wage to your employees, but if they are benefiting your company or your organization in such a way that you are gaining, are you evaluating them fairly for raises or improving their standard of living or keeping them where you've got them because that's the wage they're working for? That's an honest evaluation of where your heart is. Is it for the benefit of the company and then also for your employees? Or is it for the benefit of you so that the more you bring in, the more you get to keep? Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with that necessarily. It just means to be honest in your evaluation of your effort as it is produced by the people who work for you. Employees also have temptations to sin through carelessness in work. I wanted to read Proverbs chapter 18, verse 8 to you. This one really resonated with me too. "Whoever is slack in his work is a brother to him who destroys." Pretty powerful. If you're slack in your work or not doing your best work, as I described, I was that way from about the ages of 14 to 24. I am a brother to him who destroys. I am on par with somebody who destroys the business when I am not doing the best that I can do. And I'll finish with this paragraph, and then I want to read this quote. Are we admirers or are we followers? "The distortions of something good," and also want to encourage you to read Titus chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, because laziness, jealousy, bitterness, rebelliousness, dishonesty, and theft can be a result of those temptations. But finishing this chapter, "But the distortions of something good must not cause us to think that the thing itself is evil. Employer-employee relationships in themselves are not morally neutral, but are fundamentally good and pleasing to God, because they provide many opportunities to imitate God's character and so to glorify him." Just finished a book called Live Not by Lies, which is actually a quote, and I'm going to mispronounce his last name, that Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, speaking of the communist oppression in the former Soviet Union. But the book is written by a guy named Rod Dreher. It just came out. And the book is called Live Not by Lies. But this quote caught me because I knew a little bit about Pastor Richard Wurmbrand, who Voice of the Martyrs is an outreach of the ministry that he started when he was in prison. And he said this: "Pastor Wurmbrand once wrote that there are two kinds of Christians, those who sincerely believe in God and those who just as sincerely believe that they believe." Let me repeat that. There are two kinds of Christians, those who sincerely believe in God and those who just as sincerely believe that they believe. And you can tell them apart by their actions in decisive moments. You can tell those apart in decisive moments. So you can tell if somebody's just an admirer who believes that they believe just as sincerely as those who fully do believe. And you can tell in moments of decisiveness if they're an admirer or a follower who is going to do whatever God commands them to do, regardless of the cost, regardless of the risk, regardless of the circumstance. And he gives us a multitude of ways to interact and relate with people through love, through care, through wisdom, through responsibility, through commitment, all the things that we described earlier, not only as it relates to the employer-employee relationship, but as it relates to us as people. The kind of takeaways I want to do in this one, and I'm going to share via the email, and it'll also be at thechristianbusinessproject.com/Bible study. And we're going to start with this. Are we admirers of God, or of Jesus rather, or are we followers? Are we apparently followers in those moments of decisiveness? The second one, maybe the second takeaway is, if we are employers or supervisors or managers in some capacity, are we doing right by our employees? Certainly we are paying them as Jesus commanded, but also Moses spoke through via God in Leviticus chapter 19 and Deuteronomy chapter 24. In Luke chapter 3, are we content with our wages if we're on the receiving end of that? So that second takeaway is both, are we treating our employees fairly? Or if we are the employer, are we content with the way we're being compensated? The third takeaway that we talked about is, are we glorifying God in our behavior? Are we speaking with wisdom and honesty and trustworthiness and kindness and skill and keeping our word? Those are very, very important things. So those are the three takeaways today. And we may add a fourth. There was one other in here that I'd made a note of that I didn't write down. But employment is an opportunity to glorify God, and the temptations are real, just like they are at any other time. And speaking for myself, and probably the majority of us as human beings, pride is the real temptation in being a good, just, honest, loving, kind, and wise employer, but also employee. Let me pray real quick and we'll call it a day. Father, I thank you again for the opportunity to glorify you by imitating you in leadership, but also as an employee, using wisdom and love and kindness and compassion and the skill that has evolved over time that you have put in me to learn, but also to convey if I'm responsible for other people, and to be trustworthy and to keep my word, which comes up over and over in Scripture, to treat the folks that are over me with all honor that is due to them. And if they are brothers or sisters in Christ, to be fair and committed to them, as you said in 1 Timothy chapter 6. We thank you again for this opportunity to learn more about business, to learn more about employment in your word. And I ask, just like I ask every week at this time, that we take the responsibility to evaluate ourselves honestly and to surround ourselves with people who will evaluate us honestly if we are truly followers of your son Jesus, or maybe if we're being honest, we're just admirers and we live our life a way that maybe doesn't glorify you. Father, thank you again for this time and for those that are part of this, and also for those that are going to be influenced by it. We thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen.